Let me paint you a picture. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You're standing in the heart of Central Africa. Before you lies a country. Not just any country, but a landmass roughly the size of Western Europe. Imagine the entire distance from London to Moscow, from the North Sea down to the Mediterranean. That's how big we're talking. Now, beneath your feet, trillions, with a T, trillions of dollars worth of natural resources, not worth of natural resources. Copper that powers electrical grids around the world. Cobalt that goes into every smartphone battery. Diamonds that glitter in jewelry stores from New York to Dubai. Gold, tin, and coltan, the mineral that makes your laptop, your phone, and your tablet work. You control all of this. You have absolute unchecked power for 32 years. 3 decades. 3 decades and 2 years. So tell me, what would you do with that kind of power? That kind of wealth, that kind of opportunity? Would you build world-class universities? Would you create infrastructure that rivals any developed nation? Or would you turn your country into the African superpower that every economist, political scientist, development experts predicted it would become? Or would you steal absolutely everything that wasn't nailed down and then steal the nails too? Would you wear leopard-skin, the hat that became so iconic it's now in museums? Would you rent, not buy, rent the Concorde supersonic jet just to fly to Paris for shopping trips? The same Concorde that cost 20,000 per hour to operate. Would you build a palace now in your tiny remote village with a runway long enough to land the same Concorde in the middle of the jungle? And would you turn your country, once genuinely among the richest in Africa, with more potential than almost anything on the continent, into one of the absolutely devastatingly poor places on earth? This man did exactly that. His name? And buckle up, because this is a mouthful, was Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ngebendu Wazabanga. Let me say that again, slowly. Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ngebendu Wazabanga. I hope I even got it right.
Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ngebendu Wazabanga.
Now, you might be thinking that was quite a name. Or what does it mean? Something noble, perhaps? Something about leadership or wisdom? Or it translates roughly to the all-powerful warrior who, because of his endurance and inflexible will to win, goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. I'm not making this up. I wouldn't even do it. This man legally changed his name, wrote it into law to essentially mean I am incredibly awesome and everything I touch burns to the ground. And you know what? He was half right. He definitely left fire in his wake. This is the story of Mobutu Sese Seko, the Leopard King, the man who didn't just rob his country. He became the country. The man who turned kleptocracy into an art form. The man who showed the world exactly how to steal a nation in broad daylight while international community applauded. Let's rewind to the beginning, because unlike some of the dictators we've covered, Idi Amin Mobutu didn't start out as a muscle. He started out as a writer. Joseph Désiré Mobutu, pardon my French, was born on October 14th, 1930 in Lisala, Belgian Congo, not Zaire yet. We'll get to that rebrand later. Belgian Congo, one of the most brutal colonial regimes in history. If you know your King Leopard 2 history, and if you don't, that's another series entirely. But trust me, it was horrific. Young Joseph Désiré wasn't born into power or privilege. He attended Catholic missionary school, the kind of education available to very few Congolese at the time. He was actually smart, literate, well-spoken. He worked as a journalist for the newspaper Le Avenue or The Future. Irony of that name, given what he would do to Congo's future, is almost too perfect. Then in 1949, at 19 years old, he made a decision that would change everything. He joined the Force Publique. That was Belgium's colonial army in Congo. Not exactly a noble institution, but it gave young Mobutu something crucial: military training, organization, discipline, and most importantly, connections. He rose through the ranks, not because of battlefield heroics, but because he was smart, organized, and he knew how to navigate power structures. Remember, that skill was going to serve him very well later. Now, let's fast forward to June 30th, 1960, one of the most important dates in African history. Congo gains independence from Belgium. After 75 years of brutal colonial rule, the Congolese people are finally free. The celebrations are massive. There is singing in the streets, dancing, hope, genuine hope that finally, Congo can control its own destiny. And democratically elected as the first prime minister is this man, Patrice Lumumba. Now, if you don't know who Lumumba was, let me tell you. He was brilliant, charismatic, a true Pan-Africanist. He was Malcolm X and Kwame Nkrumah rolled into one. He gave speeches that made crowds erupt. He talked about genuine independence, not the fake kind where your former colonizer still controls your economy, your resources, your foreign policy. He meant actual sovereignty. And that's where the problem started. See, Congo wasn't just any country. It was and still is one of the most resource-rich places on planet Earth. It had copper, diamonds, gold, and something even more valuable in 1960, uranium. The same uranium that went into the atomic bombs that dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That came from Congo, specifically from Shinkolobwe mine in Katanga province. The Manhattan Project, the American program to build the atomic bomb, depended on Congolese uranium. So when Lumumba started talking about nationalizing resources, about Congolese control of Congolese minerals, about ending exploitation, Belgium panicked. The United States panicked. Mining corporations panicked. Because Lumumba wasn't playing the game. He wasn't going to be a puppet. He actually meant what he said about independence. Let that sink in. And that made him very dangerous. In Washington, D.C., at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, cables were flying back and forth. Meetings were being held. Plans were actually being made. And they turned to someone they thought that could work with him. Someone in the military, someone ambitious, someone who seemed more interested in power than in ideology. They turned to Colonel Joseph Desire Mobutu. Now, here's where the story gets really dark, and I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you isn't conspiracy theory. This isn't speculation. This is documented history, historical fact, confirmed by declassified CIA documents that were released in the 1990s. In September 1960, just 3 months after independence, Mobutu launched his first coup. He removed Lumumba from power, not violently yet, but he neutralized him, placed him under house arrest, cut him off from his supporters. And the CIA, they were right there, backing him, advising him, but most importantly, funding him. In fact, CIA operatives had been given authorization. I'm reading from actual documents here to assassinate Lumumba if necessary. They had poison ready. Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA's chief poison specialist, flew to Congo with a lethal biological agent designed to look like natural causes. Think about that. The United States government, the supposed bastion of freedom and democracy, was actively plotting to murder a democratically elected leader in Africa because he wanted actual independence for his country. But they didn't need to use the poison. On January 17th, 1961, Patrice Lumumba was taken from his detention. He was 35 years old. He was driven to a location in Katanga province, the mineral-rich region that had attempted to secede with Belgian backing. He was tortured, sadly, then executed. His body was dissolved in sulfuric acid, so there would be no grave, no martyr resting place, no shrine for his supporters. Then, the man who could have led Africa to genuine sovereignty and prosperity was murdered at 35 years old with explicit Western backing. Kenya, I need you to hear this clearly. This is what happens when external powers decide your leadership doesn't deserve their interests. Kiwi, think of the IMFs, the World Banks, and their insidious plans and requirements for every loan, every coin, every dollar they give to our presidents. Lumumba's assassination wasn't just a Congolese tragedy. It was a message. It was a warning to every African leader. Play ball with us or else we'll deal with you. After Lumumba's death, Congo descended into chaos. Multiple factions fighting for control. Katanga trying to secede. Kasai in rebellion. Different provinces declaring autonomy. The whole country was fragmenting. And through it all, Mobutu waited, building alliances, consolidating control in the military, learning, watching. And on November 24th, 1965, Colonel Mobutu launched his second coup. This time, he didn't hand power to anyone else. This time he was keeping it. He declared himself president. He dissolved parliament. He banned political parties. And you know what the reaction was from the West? Relief. Actual relief. Because Mobutu promised one thing. He would be staunchly anti-communist, and he would keep Congo in the Western sphere of influence. He would let American and Belgian companies continue exploiting Congolese resources. Here he is with John F. Kennedy in 1963 before the final coup. With Richard Nixon, with Gerald Ford, with Jimmy Carter, yes, even Carter, the human rights president, with Ronald Reagan, who literally, and I have a quote right here, called Mobutu a voice of good sense and good will. A voice of good sense about a man who was actively and systematically stealing billions of dollars from one of Africa's poorest population. Imagine. Lessons for Kenyan. Lesson number 1. When Western powers call your leader a reliable partner, a voice of good sense, and a strategically important, immediately check your national treasury. Often, what they really mean is he lets us exploit your resources and doesn't ask uncomfortable questions. But here's the thing about Mobutu. He wasn't content with just being a dictator. He wasn't satisfied with just stealing money. No, Mobutu had a grander plan. He was going to rebrand himself, rebrand his country, and create an entirely new ideology around himself. And that's where things get truly, truly absurd. The year is 1971. Mobutu has been in power for 6 years. He's consolidated control, eliminated rivals, but built a security apparatus, and now he's ready for phase 2 of his grand plan. He launches what he calls authenticity. Authenticity is it's French for authenticity. The campaign to make Congo authentically African again. Now, on the surface, this sounds brilliant or even amazing, right? Reclaiming African identity, rejecting colonial names and symbols, African pride, decolonization in its force and action. Kenya or Tanzania or the Greater East Africa, you went through similar processes. Africanization, indigenization, replacing colonial names. It's natural, necessary. It's a natural, necessary part of independence. Except Mobutu's version was complete Utter performative bullshit. Let me show you what I mean. First, the name changes. The country's name changed from Republic of Congo to Republic of Zaire, taken from the Portuguese mispronunciation of the Kikongo word Nzere, or Nzadi, meaning river. So he named the country after what Portuguese colonizers called Congo River. Very authentic. The currency changed from the Congolese franc to the Zaire. Regional. Leopoldville, named after the genocidal maniac King Leopard II, became Kinshasa. Good change, actually. Stanleyville became Kisangani, also good. Elizabethville became Lubumbashi. Fine. But then came the part where Mobutu decided every single Congolese citizen had to abandon their Christian names and adopt authentic African names. This wasn't optional. This was law. If your name was Pierre, Jacques, Marie, or Peter, or for whatever any other colonial names, you had to change them or face consequences. And Mobutu led by example. Joseph Désiré Mobutu became Mobutu Sese Seko Kuku Ngbendu Wazabanga. The all-powerful warrior who, because of his endurance and inflexible will to win, goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. Imagine if an American president changed his name to George Washington, Unstoppable Freedom Eagle Lightning Bolt Democracy Thunder. That's the level of ego we are talking about. But Mobutu wasn't done. Next came the dress code. He banned Western suits and ties, completely banned them. If you are a man in Zaire and you wore a suit and tie, you could be arrested. Instead, he created the Abacost, shorts for Abbas le costume, French for down with the suit. It was basically a Nehru jacket, a highly collared, short-sleeved jacket based on Mao suits. And it became mandatory for all men in government and professional settings. Women weren't allowed to wear pants. They had to wear traditional African wraps. No jeans, no slacks, traditional dresses only. Now, here's where the hypocrisy became almost comedic, if it weren't so tragic. When Mobutu was forcing everyday Zairens to reject Western influence, to dress authentically and to embrace African identity, what was Mobutu himself doing? He was chartering the Concorde, the supersonic passenger jet, the absolute pinnacle of Western technological luxury, to fly to Paris. Not to Nairobi, not to Accra or to Lagos. Paris. The complete African. And what to do? To go shopping on the Champs-Élysées. Let me put this in perspective. The Concorde cost approximately $20,000 per hour to operate in the 1970s. That's equivalent of about $100,000 per hour today. A round trip from Kinshasa to Paris took about 8 hours. That's a total of $160,000 per trip in 1970s money. About $800,000 today. And he did this regularly. Not once, not twice. I mean regularly. But that's just the beginning. Let me tell you about Badlight was Mobutu's birth village, a tiny remote settlement in northern Zaire, in the middle of the jungle, no particular strategic importance, no economic significance. Mobutu turned it into his personal Versailles. He built a palace complex. And when I say a palace, I mean a complex with multiple buildings, each one decorated in the style of different European palaces. One wing style like the Versailles, another after the Fontainebleau, another with Chinese pagodas, because why not throw Asia into the mix? And here's the kicker. He built a runway, a full international airport runway in the middle of the jungle, long enough to land a bloody Concorde. Think about the engineering required for that, the cost, the resources, the labor. Also, he could fly his Concorde directly from Paris to his village. Oh, and the village didn't have reliable electricity. So he built hydroelectric dams, multiple dams just to power his palace. Not to power hospitals in Kinshasa, not to power schools or to power factories. His palace in his village in the middle of absolutely nowhere. Inside the palace, French chefs imported from France, wine cellars stocked with the finest French vintages, ballrooms with crystal chandeliers, gold-plated bathroom fixtures. My God! For an African. Meanwhile, in Kinshasa, the capital city, electricity was parodic at best. Running water was a luxury and roads were disintegrating. But the palaces and the Concorde trips, as obscene as they were, those were just the visible symbols of theft. The real theft was happening in banks, in budgets, in state coffers. By the 1980s, Mobutu's personal fortune was estimated at $5 billion. $5 billion. In 1980s money, that's the equivalent of about $15 billion today. Imagine. He had at least 17 known bank accounts in Belgium alone. Villas in Switzerland, in France, in Morocco, in Spain, in Belgium. He owned 14 palaces just in Zaire. And here's the most bizarre part. There was no distinction between state funds and Mobutu's personal accounts. He would literally sign checks from the Central Bank of Zaire to himself, not even hiding it, not even pretending there was a difference between government money and Mobutu's money. Let me show you the numbers. Personal fortune, 5 billion, equivalent to 15 billion today. Palaces owned, 14 within Zaire. Properties outside Zaire, villas in Switzerland, France, Morocco, Belgium, Spain, Ivory Coast. Percentage of national budget stolen annually, estimates range from 15 to 20%. Belgium bank accounts, at least 17 known accounts. Swiss bank accounts, multiple, exact number unknown. Duration of theft, 32 years, from 1965 to 1997. 32 years of systemic and systematic institutionalized theft. African authenticity means absolutely nothing if it's just a costume for kleptocracy. Real sovereignty, real independence means accountable governance, not performative nationalism, while the looting continues behind the scenes. Now, Mobutu wasn't stupid. He knew he needed to maintain his image. He needed spectacle. He needed to show the world that Zaire was important and that he was actually important. So in 1974, he did something genuinely iconic. October 30th, 1974, Kinshasa, Zaire. The Rumble in the Jungle. Muhammad Ali versus George Foreman for the heavyweight championship of the world. And it was a spectacular, genuinely one of the most iconic sporting events in history. Muhammad Ali, who'd been stripped of his titles for refusing to fight in the Vietnam, getting his chance at redemption. Ali arrived in Kinshasa and said, and this became famous, "I'm in Africa, I'm home." The crowd went absolutely wild, chanting, "Ali Bomaye, kill him, Ali, kill him." The fight itself was incredible. Ali was the underdog. Everyone thought Foreman would destroy him. Instead, Ali used his famous rope-a-dope strategy, letting Foreman tire himself out, then knocked him out in the 8th round. It was beautiful. It was historic. It put Zaire on the global map. Mobutu paid $10 million to host this fight. $10 million. In 1974 money, that's equivalent of about $60 million today. What? Now let me tell you what $10 million could have built in 1974 Zaire. 50 modern hospitals with full equipment. 200 schools with trained teachers. Clean water systems for 500,000 people. Roads connecting rural areas to markets. Agricultural extension services for thousands of farmers. That is what that kind of money would have done for Zaire. Instead, hospitals in Kinshasa lacked basic medicines, aspirin, antibiotics, bandages, for heaven's sake. Schools had no books, no pencils, no desks. Children sat on dirt floors. The roads were crumbling. Some had been completely reclaimed by the jungle. But hey, we got the boxing match. The world watched. Zaire was famous for a night, right? And Mobutu didn't stop there. He also hosted a 3-night music festival alongside the fight. James Brown, B.B. King, Miriam Makeba, The Spinners, Bill Withers, and Zairean musician Franco Luambo, Tabule, TPOK Jazz. All performative works. The music was incredible, genuinely incredible. The documentary Soul Power captured it, and it's worth watching if you haven't actually seen it before. But again, the money spent on 3 nights of concerts could have funded university scholarships for thousands of Zairean students for years. This is the kleptocratic playbook, and I need you to understand it clearly. Distract with spectacle. Give people bread and circuses. One big shiny event that everyone talks about and everyone remembers, while you steal everything else that isn't nailed down. Lesson 2. When leaders focus on spectacular one-off events, stadia, festivals, summits, rather than boring, consistent investment in healthcare, education, and infrastructure, ding, 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 they're usually stealing. The stadium gets ribbon-cutting ceremony and a photo op. The stolen millions don't. But eventually, even the most elaborate performances can't hide reality. By the 1980s, Zaire's reality was impossible to hide. By the 1980s, Zaire wasn't just failing. It was disintegrating. And I want to be clear about something. This wasn't a natural disaster. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't unavoidable circumstances. This was deliberate destruction through systematic theft and neglect. Let me show you what I mean. In the 1960s, when the Congo gained independence, it had about 90,000 miles of road. Not all paved, but functional, maintained, connecting cities, towns, villages, and ports. By 1990, fewer than 10% of those roads were usable. Not in poor condition, not needing repairs, completely unusable, reclaimed by the jungle. I mean, gone. The road from Kinshasa to Matadi, the port city that connects Zaire to the ocean, absolutely vital for trade, took 8 hours. 8 hours. By 1990s, 3 days. If you were lucky. If your vehicle didn't break down. If you didn't get stuck in the mud. The railway system, built by the Belgium, as brutal as they were, they built infrastructure completely collapsed. Trains stopped running. Tracks rusted. Stations were completely abandoned. And here's maybe the most tragic symbol of it all. The Inga Dam. The Inga Dam complex, built on the Congo River, had the potential to generate 40,000 megawatts of electricity. That is enough to power half of Africa. Let me repeat that. Half of Africa. One dam complex could theoretically provide electricity for 600 million people on this continent. By the 1990s, it was operating at less than 10% capacity. Why? Not technical problems. Not natural disasters again. Maintenance was too expensive. Too expensive for the government of a country sitting on trillions of dollars of resources. But not too expensive for Mobutu's to charter Concords to Paris. Not too expensive to build 14 palaces. The truth, Mobutu stole the maintenance budget. Just took it, put it into his personal accounts. That should get you angry. Hospitals closed, not because of lack of need. Obviously, people were still getting sick, but because there was no money for supplies, no money for salaries, no money for electricity to run any of the equipment they had, and they had few. Doctors and nurses, when they showed up at all, had to work without basic supplies. Zaire had 3 major universities, and they became political prisons. Students who protested were arrested. Professors who criticized the government disappeared. And academic freedom? What's that? And then there was the currency. Inflation didn't just spiral, it launched into space. By the early 1990s, inflation was running at 9,800% annually. Think about that number. Let me put that into terms you can understand. If you had 100 Zaires in your pocket at the beginning of the year, by the end of the year, it was worth 1 Zaire. The currency was redenominated multiple times. They'd knock off zeros, issue new bills. But that didn't matter. The problem wasn't the zeros. The problem was the theft. Eventually, people just stopped using money altogether in many areas. They went back to barter, trading goods directly, chickens for tools, vegetables for cloth, because paper money was literally worthless. And here's where things get really dark. Government workers, the teachers, nurses, civil servants, police officers, soldiers, went months and months without pay, sometimes a year without a single pay. But Mobutu expected them to keep showing up, keep working. So what happened? What do you think happened? Soldiers at checkpoints stopped checking IDs and started demanding for bribes. Not might demand bribes sometimes. I mean, systematically, institutionally demanding bribes from everyone who passed. No money. They'd take your goods, your food, whatever you had. Teachers started charging students for classes, for chalk, for using a desk. Bloody, for everything. Want your child to learn? Pay up. Police, they became indistinguishable from criminals. They'd set up roadblocks and just rob people willy-nilly. Official uniforms, official vehicles, official robbery. Now, you might think, or you might be thinking, that's just corruption. That's what happens everywhere to some degree. And you might be right. Some level of corruption exists in most, if not all, countries. But this wasn't individual corruption. This was systemic. This was institutional. Mobutu had created a system where corruption wasn't a bug. It was a feature. It was the system itself. When you don't pay state employees, but you expect them to survive, they become predators on the population. They have to. And that serves the dictators perfectly. Because now, everyone is complicit. Everyone is dirty. No one has clean hands to point fingers at anyone. Let's think about that point. Think about Kenya. For a second, if I could remind you or take you back to the 90s, to one of our very own authoritarian or dictator, President Daniel Toroitich arap Moi. In his tenure, corruption became so rampant that everyone had to try and find ways of making money anyhow. It became, we as a nation became so tainted that by the time President Kibaki was coming or ascending into power, we didn't know what was right and what was wrong. It had become a staple way of life. Now back, let me show you the numbers. GDP per capita in 1960 was $392. For comparison, South Korea's was at 156 and Zaire was richer. GDP per capita in 1995 was $120. Meanwhile, South Korea's was $13,000. Inflation rate, early 90s, was 9,800 annually. Life expectancy drop fell 7 years between 1960 and 1990, while most countries saw increases. Percentage of roads functional. By 1990, less than 10%. Percentage of population with access to clean water fell from 40% to 25%. Literacy rate actually declined. One of the few countries where literacy went backwards. My gosh. So how did Mobutu stay in power through all of this? 4 main strategies. Strategy number 1. What was the word Washington used? Indispensable. The United States gave him weapons, military training, economic aid, political cover in the United Nations. France sadly did the same. They had their own interest in keeping Francophone Africa stable, or at least what they called stable. Belgium, despite everything, turned a blind eye. Too many Belgian businesses were still operating in Zaire, still profiting. As long as Mobutu said, I am anti-communist, as long as he let Western companies extract resources, or as long as he voted the right way in the UN, he could do whatever he wanted to his own people. The West actually looked the other way. Strategy number 2, divide and rule. Mobutu constantly rotated government officials. Cabinet ministries or ministers would serve for a few months, maybe a year, then suddenly find themselves demoted, transferred, or fired, or even sometimes arrested. The strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. Never let anyone build an independent power base. Never let anyone become too comfortable. But mostly, never let anyone accumulate enough influence to actually challenge you. He also played ethnic groups against each other masterfully. Zaire has over 200 ethnic groups. Mobutu would favor one group, give them positions and resources, and then suddenly shift favor to a different group. This kept everyone off balance, kept ethnic tensions simmering, kept people focused on competing with each other instead of uniting against him or his rule. And he created this mythology that only Mobutu could hold Zaire together. That without him, the country will disintegrate into ethnic violence and chaos. Sounds familiar? That's the dictator's favorite lie. Without me, everything falls apart. Strategy number 3, the presidential guard. While regular soldiers went months without pay, starving, in tattered uniforms, the Presidential Guard Division Special Presidente ate well, got paid, had modern weapons, lived in decent barracks. They were loyal to one person, Mobutu Sese Seko, and not to Zaire, not to the people, not to Mobutu, but to Mobutu personally. And everyone knew if you threaten Mobutu, the Presidential Guard will come for you, and they will not be gentle in any way. Strategy number 4, universal complicity. And this is the genius level evil I mentioned earlier. Mobutu normalized corruption so completely, so thoroughly, that everyone became complicit. Government ministers stole, and everyone knew it. Army officers stole, and everyone knew it. Police stole. Judges took bribes. Custom officials took bribes. Everyone at every level was dirty. And that's the trap. When everyone is corrupt, everyone has something to lose if the system changes. If you're a government official who's been stealing for 20 years, do you really want an honest government that might investigate you? If you're a judge who's been taking bribes, do you want a judicial reform, really? Mobutu built a nation of accomplices, a nation where everyone had blood on their hands. Systemic corruption isn't just theft. It's a control mechanism. When everyone is implicated, revolutions become risky because the corrupt system becomes everyone's system. This is why anti-corruption cannot be selective. It must be systematic, comprehensive, and prosecute without fear or favor. By the 1990s, Zaire was hemorrhaging people. Not just descendants, not just political opponents, ordinary people, doctors, teachers, engineers, skilled workers were fleeing to Kenya, to Tanzania, to Zambia, to Congo, Brazzaville, to anywhere they could get to. The brain drain was so catastrophic. And then in 1994, something happened that would ultimately seal Mobutu's fate. The Rwandan genocide. Between April and July of 1994, approximately 800,000 Tutsis and moderate Hutus were murdered in Rwanda. When the genocide ended and the Rwandan Patriotic Front took power, approximately 1 million Hutus fled into eastern Zaire, not just civilians. The genocidaires, people who had participated in the genocide, fled into Zaire too, with their weapons. Now, here's what Mobutu should have done. Work with Rwanda and the international community to separate the refugees from the genocidaires, ensuring humanitarian aid reached civilians while preventing militants from regrouping. But here's what Mobutu actually did. He saw an opportunity. He used the Hutu refugees and militants as a buffer, as leverage against Uganda and Rwanda, who he suspected of supporting his opponents. He let the militants operate from Zairean territory, launching raids back into Rwanda. But Rwanda and Uganda had had enough. And in 1996, Rwanda and Uganda backed a rebellion led by Laurent Desire Kabila, a longtime opponent of Mobutu who'd been in the bush for decades, the Alliance of Democratic Forces of the Liberation of Congo, Zaire, AFDL. They started in the east in October 1996 and began marching west towards Kinshasa. And here's the thing, Mobutu's army barely fought. City after city fell to the rebels. Not because the rebels were overwhelmingly military force, but because Mobutu's soldiers had no reason to fight for him. They hadn't been paid in months, sometimes in years. Their families were starving, and Mobutu had stolen everything from them and their country. So when the rebels arrived, many soldiers just walked away, took off their uniforms and went home. So some actually joined the rebels. Meanwhile, Mobutu himself was tragically dying. Prostate cancer. He was 66 years old, sick and watching his empire crumble. He tried to rally. He tried to reorganize. He hired Serbian mercenaries to fight for him. Unfortunately, that didn't matter. The army wouldn't fight. The people wouldn't rally to his defense. And on May 16th, 1997, Kabila's forces entered Kinshasa. Mobutu had already fled first to Congo and then to Morocco, where his old friend King Hassan II gave him refuge. On September the 7th, 1997, in Rabat, Morocco, Mobutu Sese Seko died of prostate cancer. He was 66 years old. He never faced justice, never stood trial for the billions he stole. He never answered for the country he destroyed. He died comfortable, wealthy. Even in exile, he had access to millions surrounded by family. While the country he left behind continued, sadly, to burn. Laurent Kabila entered Kinshasa promising a new beginning. He renamed the country again from Zaire back to the Democratic Republic of Congo. He promised to rebuild, to fight corruption, to restore dignity. He was lying. Or maybe he meant it initially. It doesn't matter. The result was the same. What followed was catastrophic. First, there was the First Congo War. The war that brought Kabila to power, that killed hundreds of thousands. Then came the Second Congo War. Starting in 1998, 9 African nations became involved. Angola, Chad, Namibia, Sudan, Zimbabwe, all on one side. Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, supporting various rebel groups on the other. Some call it Africa's World War, and they're not exaggerating. Because between 1996 and 2003, an estimated 5.4 million people died. 5.4 million human beings. That's more than the entire population of Sierra Leone. That's more than the entire population of Liberia. That's roughly the population of Denmark, just gone. And most didn't die in battle. They died from disease, starvation, displacement. They died because hospitals didn't function. They died because roads didn't exist to bring food aid. They died because water systems had already collapsed. They died because the infrastructure decay and the institutional destruction that Mobutu had caused over 32 years caused them to die. You see, Mobutu didn't just steal money. He stole the country's ability to function. He stole its future. When you destroy hospitals, when you let roads disappear, when you dismantle education, or when you corrupt every institution, that destruction doesn't just affect the present. It destroys the country's capacity to recover from any crisis. Today, right now, as you're watching this, Eastern Congo is still unstable. Armed groups still control mining areas. Conflict minerals, coltan, which is in your smartphone, your laptop, your tablets, are still being mined by people living in conditions barely different from slavery. Women are still being raped as a weapon of war. Children are still being recruited as soldiers. The UN has had peacekeeping forces in Congo since 1999. 26 years. The longest continuous UN peacekeeping mission in the world. And Eastern Congo is still not stable. Let me show you Mobutu's complete legacy. Deaths directly caused during his rule. 1965 to 1997. Political killings, prisons, torture. 200,000 to 500,000 estimated. Wars triggered after his fall. First Congo War, 1996 to 1997, hundreds of thousands dead. Second Congo War, between 1998 to 2003, 5.4 million people dead. Economic destruction, GDP per capita decline, 65% drop from 1960 to 1997. From being richer than South Korea to one of the poorest countries on earth. Current state of the DRC, Human Development Index, it's 179th out of 191 countries. That's nearly dead last. Life expectancy, 60 years, compared to 77 in Kenya. 60 years. Poverty rate, over 70% living on less than $2.15 a day. Ongoing conflict, Eastern region still unstable. Let that sink in. 32 years of one man's theft, millions dead, generations destroyed, a nation that still hasn't and doesn't look as though it's going to recover anytime soon. Failed states don't stay failed in isolation. They metastasize like cancer. Regional instability affects everyone. Tanzania shares a 950-mile border with DRC. What happens there will affect you. This is why supporting good governance everywhere in the region isn't charity. It is self-defense. So, what do we learn from Mobutu Sese Seko? Let me break it down systematically because they aren't abstract lessons. These are practical warnings. Lesson 1. Western validation doesn't always equal moral endorsement. When international leaders praise your president, ask why. Are they praising good governance, or are they praising someone who lets them exploit your resources? Kenya, when Western powers praised Jomo Kenyatta despite political assassination, despite land grabs, and despite the ethnic favoritism, that should have been a red flag. Those weren't endorsements of democracy. They were endorsements of someone who played ball with Western interests. When Western donors praised John Magufuli initially for cutting waste and fighting corruption, they went conspicuously silent as he crushed press freedom, attacked the judiciary, and suppressed opposition. Pay attention to that silence. China praises your leaders too now. By the way, same game, same different player. When external powers, Western, Chinese, Middle Eastern, whoever calls your leaders a valued partner or a voice of stability, check your treasury, guys. Check your resource extraction contracts. Check what are you giving away. Lesson 2. Performative nationalism is a scam. Performative nationalism is always a scam. Mobutu wrapped himself in African identity, African names, African clothes, authenticity, while living like Louis the Fifth. Any leader who makes a big show of patriotism or nationalism, of African first rhetoric, while their children are educated in London, while they fly to Dubai for medical care, while their money is in offshore accounts, while they buy property in Paris, Dubai, they are running the Mobutu Sese Seko playbook. When politicians wrap themselves in the flag and talk about dynasties versus hustler, then both sides loot the treasury. You're watching political theater designed to distract you from shared kleptocracy. When leaders in Tanzania talk about patriotism and sovereignty, but use that rhetoric to silence criticism, to suppress opposition, and to avoid accountability, that's not patriotism. That's authoritarianism with better marketing. Real patriotism is building functioning institutions, boring things like effective tax collection, working hospitals, maintained roads, independent courts. Flags and anthems are nice, but they do not educate children or cure diseases. Lesson 3, corruption isn't just theft. It is state capture. Understand that corruption at a certain scale isn't just theft. It is state capture. Mobutu didn't just steal money. He corrupted the system so completely that corruption became system itself. When police have to extort to survive, when teachers have to charge bribes to make a living, when judges have to take payments because their salaries don't come, when soldiers loot because they are not paid, that's not individual corruption, that's systemic failure. East Africa struggles with corruption. The question isn't whether corruption exists. It does, everywhere. The question is corruption the exception or the rule? When a Kenyan needs to pay a bribe to get a birth certificate, that's systemic. When a Tanzanian business person has to pay bribes at multiple levels of government just to operate legally, that is systemic. And here is the trap Mobutu built. When everyone is implicated, when everyone has participated in corruption, even just to survive, revolution becomes terrifying because the corrupt system is now everyone's system. And this is why anti-corruption cannot be selective. It cannot be targeted only at opposition members or only certain ethnic groups. It must be systematic, comprehensive, and fair. Or it's just political revenge dressed up as reform. Think about it clearly. Do you see why the likes of Maraga, the likes of Omukia, do not make headlines, do not become the leaders that the world applauds? Because they are the exception to the rule that is corruption. Because if you look at both sides, both at the government that is currently running in Kenya and to the supposed opposition that is led by the likes of Gachagua, they are both cut from the same cloth. They both have crazy court cases over corruption. Their teams are filled with ladies and gentlemen, or men and women that say that they fight corruption, but they perpetuate corruption to the core. So, before we go into the 2027 election, think about that. Before you decide who is your opposition and who is your incumbent, maybe it's time we think, can we get the exception and not the rule? Fourth, institutional decay is hard to reverse. Institutional decay is exponentially hard to reverse. Mobutu ruled for 32 years. The DRC has spent 28 years trying to recover, and it is still failing. Just think about that. 32 years in power have caused a 28-year onslaught trying to recover, but has dug them even deeper. Institutions take decades to build. They can be destroyed, sadly, in a few years. Every time you backslide towards authoritarianism, closing media, attacking courts, suppressing opposition, you are destroying what took generations to build. Kenya, you've oscillated between democratic gains and backsliding since independence. The 2010 constitution was a triumph, genuine devolution, Bill of Rights, independent institutions. But a constitution is only as strong as the people defending it. Every time you fail to prosecute powerful people who break the law, every time you let politicians undermine the judiciary, every time you allow ethnic incitement without consequences, you're eroding that very constitution. Lesson 5, resource wealth without accountability is a curse. Resource wealth without accountability is a curse and not a blessing. Congo is one of the most resource-rich places on planet Earth. It should be one of the richest country, if not the richest country in the world. Instead, it's one of the poorest. Why? Because one man and his cronies stole everything. In Kenya, we discovered oil in Turkana. The initial estimates were modest, not Saudi Arabia levels, but significant. Tanzania have natural gas deposits off their coast, potentially transformative amounts. But both of us should learn from the Congo, learn from Nigeria, learn from Equatorial Guinea. Norway discovered oil. They created a sovereign wealth fund, completely transparent, with independent oversights. Today, that fund is worth over $1.7 trillion. Every Norwegian benefits. Nigeria discovered oil. The elites stole it. Today, despite being Africa's largest oil producer, Nigeria has massive poverty, terrible infrastructure, and ever-going conflict. The difference? Institutions. Transparency, accountability, demand to know where every shilling, every dollar from natural resources actually goes. Demand independent audits. Demand that resource revenue goes directly to specific development projects that can be tracked. Demand that sovereign wealth funds with transparent governance are built. Do this now before the extraction begins. Because once the money is flowing and people have gotten used to stealing it, it becomes almost impossible to reform. Mobutu Sese Seko stole an entire country. Not metaphorically, not exaggerating for effect, but literally. He took a nation that in the 1960s had everything, resource, potential, and a young educated population eager. Mobutu Sese Seko stole not only their present, but their future, and for the years to come. May this remain a lesson to all of us as Kenyans. May we now, as we prepare to go into the election, question the ethos, the ethics. How did most of these politicians make their wealth? How do they continue to, go abroad for treatment while our hospitals languish? Is that the future that you want? Is that what you want to leave to your children? If we are to protect Kenya and save Kenya from Mobutu Sese Seko's playbook, we have to be deliberate, vigilant, active, and ensure that we hold each and every politician or anyone that wants to take public office to the highest level of scrutiny, not just by listening to their words or taking them at their word value, but looking at how they actually act, looking at their past, where the source of their wealth, and deciding whether they really are or have Kenya at heart. This has been your host, DY, and thank you for listening through episode 2 of Africa's Worst Dictators series. Keep it locked, like, share, subscribe, and let's comment, and let's stay vigilant, because that's the only way we take control of our country. Asante sana. God bless you guys, and God bless Kenya.